In 1875, the empire that once made European kings tremble. An empire that stretched from Algiers to Baghdad, that had besieged Vienna twice, declared it could no longer pay its debts. Not to an invading army, not to a rebellion, to its own bankers. Within 6 years, foreign officials were sitting inside Ottoman ministries, collecting Ottoman taxes, before a single Ottoman soldier had lost a war over it. The Sultan still wore the crown, but the empire's money was no longer his. This is the story of how the most feared empire in the Mediterranean didn't fall to a battlefield, it fell to a balance sheet. On this channel, we take empires apart the way accountants would. One ledger, one debt, one decision at a time, to show you how the numbers behind history quietly decide everything the headlines take credit for. To understand how this empire broke, you have to understand how it was built. Not on conquest alone, but on a financial machine most people never hear about. For 3 centuries, the Ottoman state ran on a system called the timar, land granted to cavalry soldiers in exchange for tax collection and military service. No standing salary, no royal treasury drain, the empire's army essentially funded itself. It was, for its time, one of the most efficient military fiscal systems on earth. It let the Ottomans field enormous armies without bankrupting the state, which is exactly how they took Constantinople in 1453 and reached the gates of Vienna by 1529. But efficient systems built for one era rarely survive the next one. And by the late 1500s, 3 forces were already pulling at the foundation. First, gunpowder warfare was making the timar cavalry obsolete. Second, a flood of cheap Spanish-American silver was about to hit Ottoman markets. And third, new sea routes around Africa were quietly stealing the empire's oldest source of wealth. Here's what most documentaries skip. The Ottoman Empire's first real economic wound wasn't military, it was inflation. Between 1500 and 1600, Spain shipped staggering amounts of silver out of its American colonies into Europe. And from Europe, that silver bled straight into Ottoman markets through trade. The Ottoman currency, the akçe, was a silver coin with a fixed, trusted value for generations. Suddenly, it wasn't scarce anymore. Between 1580 and 1610 alone, the Ottoman treasury debased the akçe multiple times, and its silver content dropped by roughly 44%. Prices in Istanbul are estimated to have risen by 500 to 900% over the course of the 16th century. Soldiers paid in fixed-value akçe watched their real income collapse in real time, which is exactly what triggered the first major Janissary revolts of the 1590s. This wasn't a coincidence. It was cause and effect. Debase the currency, and eventually the men holding the swords notice their pay is worthless. For a while, conquest covered the damage. New territory meant new tax revenue, new trade routes, and new resources flowing back to Istanbul. At its height in the late 1600s, the Ottoman Empire controlled roughly 5.2 million square kilometers across 3 continents, with a population estimated between 25 and 35 million people, one of the largest tax bases on Earth. But growth was doing something dangerous. It was hiding a structural problem instead of fixing it. The empire was still running on a medieval land tax model, while its European rivals, England, the Dutch Republic, France, were building something entirely new: centralized banking, national debt markets, and joint stock companies that could raise capital in days instead of years. By 1683, when Ottoman forces failed to take Vienna for the second and final time, the expansion that had been masking the empire's financial fragility simply stopped. And once the borders stopped growing, the cracks underneath had nowhere left to hide. And this is really where the story turns. From an empire straining under old habits to an empire actively selling off its own future. If you want to see exactly how that happened, hit subscribe now, because it only gets more brutal from here. The real turning point came in the 19th century. And it started with a war the Ottomans technically survived, the Crimean War, 1853 to 1856. To fight it, the Ottoman government did something it had never formally done before. It took out a foreign loan from British and French banks in 1854. It seemed manageable at first, one loan to cover one war. But it set a pattern the empire couldn't break. Reform programs, palace construction, a modernizing military, and a growing bureaucracy all needed cash. The tax base couldn't generate fast enough. So the government kept borrowing from European markets at increasingly punishing interest rates. Between 1854 and 1875, the Ottoman state took out at least 15 separate foreign loans. By 1875, total Ottoman foreign debt is estimated at roughly 200 million Ottoman lira, and due to the steep discounts and fees European banks charged on each loan, historians estimate the empire may have received barely half of that amount in actual usable cash, while still owing interest on the full total. It was structurally impossible to pay off. By October 1875, the math finally broke. The Ottoman government announced it could only pay half the interest owed on its foreign debt, and even that promise collapsed within a year. In 1876, the empire formally defaulted. The consequences weren't just financial embarrassment. In 1881, under pressure from European creditor nations, the Ottoman government signed the decree of Muharrem, creating the Ottoman Public Debt Administration. This was an institution run largely by European bondholder representatives, with direct control over collecting specific Ottoman tax revenues. The salt monopoly, tobacco taxes, stamp duties, and more were funneled straight to European creditors before the Ottoman treasury ever saw a lira. By the early 1900s, the Public Debt Administration employed roughly 5,000 officials, more staff than many entire Ottoman government ministries, and controlled close to a third of total Ottoman state revenue. A sovereign empire was now collecting its own taxes through a foreign-run agency, just to service debts it could never fully repay. Here's the part that gets overlooked. The Ottoman Empire didn't vanish overnight because of this. In fact, parts of the system adapted. Tax collection under the Public Debt Administration actually became more efficient and less corrupt in the regions it controlled. Foreign administrators had every incentive to maximize collection. Some infrastructure, like railways and ports, even expanded, financed by the same foreign capital that was draining the treasury elsewhere. What didn't survive was Ottoman fiscal sovereignty. The empire kept its army, its sultan, its bureaucracy, but it had permanently lost control of a meaningful share of its own revenue, decades before a single shot of the First World War was fired. When the empire finally collapsed after 1918, the financial independence that makes a state truly sovereign had already been gone for nearly 40 years. The military defeat was, in a very real sense, the empire catching up to a bankruptcy it had already suffered. If this pattern sounds familiar, it should. It's played out again and again in modern economic history. A government borrows heavily to cover short-term needs. The debt outpaces the economy's ability to grow into it, and eventually, external creditors step in. Whether it's European bondholders in 1881 or the IMF and bondholders in Greece in 2010, creditors step in to directly oversee how the state collects and spends its own money as a condition for continued lending. Greece's 2010 to 2018 bailout programs involved international creditors directly monitoring Greek tax collection, privatization, and budget decisions, echoing almost eerily the Ottoman Public Debt Administration a century earlier. Argentina has defaulted on its sovereign debt 9 separate times since its independence, most recently in 2020. The mechanism the Ottomans discovered the hard way in 1881 is still the mechanism modern sovereign debt crises run on. When a state can't pay, it doesn't just lose money, it loses control. The Ottoman Empire didn't fall in a single battle. It fell in installments, a debased coin here, a foreign loan there, a decree signed in 1881 that quietly handed away control of its own revenue, decades before anyone called it collapse. By the time the empire's borders finally disappeared from the map, its finances had already belonged to someone else for a generation. Next time, we're going deep into what many historians call history's first hyperinflation-driven currency collapse. how a paper money experiment in medieval China spiraled so far out of control, it may have helped end an entire dynasty. You'll want to see how eerily it mirrors what we just covered. If you want more stories like this, where economic history explains the headlines you're seeing right now, subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss it.